Good morning, folks. This is George Spees with the Pennsylvania Office of Open Records. I'm going to ask again that if the audio is coming through, someone would type in. I had to mute one of the microphones here. And I think we're good, but I just want to make sure that I don't end up here talking and no one can hear me. So could someone type in the chat feature if my voice is coming through okay? All right. Thank you, Lewis. All right, let's go ahead and jump into the webinar here this morning. Welcome. This morning, we're going to talk about basics of the Sunshine Act, which is also known as Pennsylvania's Open Meetings Law. Couple preliminaries before we get started. Essentially, the presentation is a PowerPoint with me talking, and the PowerPoint is available on our website. The URL is on the screen right now. You would go over to the training tab and scroll down, and you can find all of the PowerPoints that we use for our trainings here at the Office of Open Records. You're welcome to download them and use them as you see fit. It's possible you have a friend or colleague who couldn't make it this morning. The PowerPoint might help them out just for your own future reference, or maybe you're conducting some sort of localized training, and you're welcome to use our resources. Also, this session is being recorded. And the recordings are typically available a couple days after the actual presentation. If you're interested in having a copy of the recording, you can phone into the office or send us an email. And I think the way it's set up now is two ways. You can get a link to the recording that will give you access, or they actually get posted on our YouTube channel, and someone will direct you there. And then finally, if you have questions, I'll try to answer them live. Type them in the chat feature. And I have two conditions. First is that, we're talking about the Sunshine Act, so let's stay on topic. And the shorter, more concise you can keep your questions, the better. What happens periodically, some folks will type in several paragraphs, and it just is very awkward for me to sit here and read through all of that while everyone else is waiting patiently. Look, if you have something that is unique to your particular situation, or like an unusually complex question, we'll do one of two things. We'll wait until the end of the presentation, and I'll come back and answer it for the good of the order, or we'll take the conversation offline, where you can call into the office or send us an email. And the process is such that your first point of contact will be one of the admin staff, who are very well versed in the Sunshine Act and can usually help you out. But if you happen to stump them, your inquiry will get escalated to one of the senior staff, and they'll get back to you as soon as we can, and hopefully get you pointed in the right direction. Now, we cannot provide legal advice. Our role with the Sunshine Act is not as an enforcement agency of any sort. Statutorily, we provide training and guidance. So that's one of the purposes here today of this particular session. All right, I think that covers all the preliminaries. So let's jump into the meat of the presentation. And I want to begin by talking about, just why is the Sunshine Act important? And I like to refer to what I call the preamble to the Sunshine Act. This is taken right out of the Open Meetings Law. And let me just read it through here real quick. The right of the public to be present at all meetings of agencies and to witness the deliberation, policy formulation, and decision-making of agencies. It's important because it's vital to the enhancement and proper functioning of the democratic process. Secrecy in public affairs undermines the faith of the public in the government and the public's effectiveness in fulfilling its role in a democratic society. Okay, a very altruistic statement, or a group of altruistic statements there, but yet it cuts to the heart of why the Sunshine Act is important. Okay, it's all about democracy. I've had the opportunity to travel to different countries where this is just not the case. The thought of someone standing up in a meeting of public officials and telling them what they think is just, not something that is done. I've been to countries where you've got guys in black suits wearing balaclavas that are carrying submachine guns. You don't know if they're the good guys or the bad guys. So the idea of, the common public, the common man, common woman, participating in observing their public officials at work is something that, I'm not going to say it's unique to the United States, but it certainly is one of the rights that we have in living in a democracy that we take for granted, but yet in other parts of the world, it just isn't done. So when folks call in with questions, whether they're members of the public or members of government agencies that are looking for guidance, say they have a scenario, we like to view the Sunshine Act as a three-legged stool. There are three main tenets that we look at to determine whether or not the actions of a meeting are consistent with the law. And first is that, was there advance notice? And if so, were there instructions on how to attend the meeting? Obviously, there would be a physical meeting, but nowadays, many agencies, and when I use this term agency, it's in a generic sense. It could be, state government. It could be a city, borough, township, an authority created by statute, a school district, a public charter school, whatever you will. But with these online meetings now, okay, how do I log in? How do I get access to the video so that I can watch the meeting? And that lends itself to the next leg of the stool. Is there an opportunity to observe the deliberations? And deliberations actually has a specific definition. And for our purposes, the context is that a deliberation is any conversation that could lead to a decision. And one of the issues that often comes up with the Sunshine Act is, were the public officials deliberating outside of the public eye? Meaning, were they talking about the merits of this particular issue so that the public didn't have a chance, didn't have an opportunity to observe those deliberations? And that brings up another point here, where my advice is that whenever you're trying to understand a law, and the Sunshine Act is no exception here, don't forget to read the definition section, okay? Because many times a law will be written in legalese, there will be vague language, there may appear to be conflicting provisions. Oftentimes that can be sorted out by reading the definition section. And like I said, the Sunshine Act is no different. Okay, and then the third leg of this three-legged stool is, was the public given the opportunity to comment prior to any decision being made by the public officials? Was there a public comment period? Okay, so typically, there's always exceptions to the rule, and there are facets of the Sunshine Act that could lead to getting an agency in trouble. But these are the three main points that we look at when someone calls us and says, was this legal? So I think it's important to have this out front as to how we tend to provide guidance. Okay, let's jump into the law itself and talk about who is covered. And like I said, we use the term agency in a generic sense. So the Sunshine Act applies to any state or local government body and all committees. Okay, you'll note that we have committees italicized because this is an issue that comes up frequently. It's like, okay, the elected board, yeah, no question, they're covered by the Sunshine Act, and whenever they gather and are deliberating over agency business, that needs to be open to the public. But what about some of these committees that they appoint? Should they also, should their gatherings be open to the public? And that's not necessarily black and white. Let's take a look at the language of the act itself. And when we get into it, the state or local government body or committee that performs an essential government function. Okay, a very subjective phrase there, Sometimes it's hard to pin down, but I'll give you a quick example. Let's say that I live in a small township and the local girls softball team won the state championship. Okay, quite an accomplishment, and we want to recognize that. So our township supervisors appoint an ad hoc committee to organize a celebration. There's going to be a parade with the fire company. It's going to go down through the township, and everyone's going to gather at the local park, and we're going to have a cookout, and we're going to recognize the girls softball team for winning the state championship. Okay, now, as much as some of you may disagree, I'm going to have to say that recognizing the efforts of the local girls softball team is not an essential government function, okay? If we didn't do this, the wheels of government would still turn, okay? And chances are that any gatherings of that ad hoc committee would not be considered a public meeting and thus subject to the provisions of the Sunshine Act, okay? Now, if I change that up a little bit, let's say that there was a standing committee where annually they review all of the township ordinances to make sure that the language is up to date, that it doesn't conflict with any state or new federal statutes, that it's still needed. You know, that it makes sense that we have this on the books, that we don't need to clear it off because, I don't know, nobody parks horse and buggies downtown anymore or something like that. That is, I would argue that is an essential government function, to make sure that all of our ordinances are up to date and that they're relevant to the things that are important to us in this day and age. So you could then argue that any gatherings of that particular committee would be subject to the Sunshine Act because they are performing an essential government function. Okay, and then this definition, this conversation, if you will, within the Sunshine Act tends to build on itself. So the next one, and the one that I consider probably the most crucial, is do the actions of this committee represent the exercising of authority to take official action? And sure enough, within the definition section of the Sunshine Act, it gives a okay. All right. Something just happened here on the screen. It kind of threw me for a curve. Okay, so making recommendations. Is the committee making recommendations back to the elected officials? If so, that constitutes official action. They are exercising authority to take official action. So, for instance, with the second committee that we described, where they're reviewing the township ordinances, their role is, once they're done with their review, is to go back to the elected officials with probably some sort of report that recommends modifying the language, maybe updating some ordinances, maybe getting rid of some other ordinances. And if that's the case, then it solidifies the opinion that the gatherings of that committee should be covered by the Sunshine Act because they are making recommendations, thus performing or taking official action per the definitions as outlined in the Sunshine Act. Okay, but let's get into this a little deeper. And I think this is important because, like I said, this is a common question that comes up. Is my committee covered? And it so happens that while there is not a lot of case law that supports the Sunshine Act, nevertheless, there is some. And one of the cases that we want to take a look at is this one, where we're answering the question, is the committee covered? And in this particular case, let me think. I'm trying to think of the citation. I think it was Ristow versus Casey. Yeah, this is the Ristow case, where the Supreme Court, in their decision, wrote about what they think is important to determine if a gathering should be covered by the Sunshine Act. And some of this builds on the language in the law itself, but I think that there's some good discussion in this particular decision that guides us, or that can guide us. And first, we answer the question, does the committee have decision-making authority? Okay. And you're asking yourself, well, why would you have a committee that doesn't have decision-making authority? Well, sometimes, and this is a little unfortunate depending on your point of view, but the best way to make a tough situation go away is to assign it to a committee and hope that they're never heard from again. Or perhaps you just want your committee to gather information. Don't come back to us with the recommendation, but rather just give us information. We'll make the decision based on the information that you've collected. And in those instances, should that committee meet, should they gather, it would not be considered a public meeting because they do not have decision-making authority. They're not making any sort of recommendation. They're not making any decision per se. Okay, and then building on this, the next question we need to answer, are the members appointed by the elected board and are they authorized to act on its behalf? Okay, again, that begs the question, why wouldn't they be appointed by the board? Well, you know, Pennsylvania government, both state and local in particular, is highly fragmented. Plus, there's history that we need to be concerned about. And I think a very good example would be public libraries, where it's not unusual to find different operating models of public libraries as you go across the Commonwealth. And in some instances, the organization of the public library predates the actual government jurisdiction that the library is located in. And you can also have public library boards that are what we call self-perpetuating, okay? We're not sure how the board was formed initially, you know, it's ancient history, but when there is a vacancy on the board, the elected officials don't fill the vacancy. Rather, the remaining public library board members go out and find a new volunteer to fill the vacancy, okay? So the members of the public library board are not appointed by the elected officials, and any decision they make regarding the public library is not on behalf of the public officials. So you could argue then that, we do a lot of arguing, but you could argue that the gatherings of the public library board based on that organizational model then are not considered public meetings. Now there are many public library boards that, given the nexus, the strong connection with the local government jurisdiction, are subject to the Sunshine Act. And there are many public library boards, interestingly, who are not subject to the Sunshine Act, but they voluntarily comply, so that if a member of the public wanted to sit in on one of their gatherings, they welcome them and treat it just like a regular Sunshine meeting. Okay, then the next one, and again, these build on each other, and this one I consider the most critical. The court asks, are the recommendations pursuant to statute, ordinance, or regulatory authority, whereby the result is the enactment or making of laws, policies, or regulation, okay? This is where we could use the example of the girls softball team, where, you know, any recommendations that that committee makes as to the parade and the barbecue at the township park are not based in statute. You're not going to find a law that says if the girls softball team wins the state championship, this is what you must do. Okay. And that doesn't result in any law that says next time the girls softball teams win the state championship, this is what we must do. Okay. It's not based on statute, and it doesn't result in any statute. Thus, it reinforces the conclusion that any gatherings of that sort of committee would not be subject to the Sunshine Act. Okay, I have talked ad nauseum here about who is covered, but still, for some of you, it may be clear as mud. If you are unsure, my recommendation is lean towards transparency, lean towards opening up the gathering and treating it as if it were covered by the Sunshine Act. And there are, a couple of reasons why I make this recommendation. First is that we're the Office of Open Records. We're the State Transparency Office. And of course, we're going to say we lean towards transparency. Open up your meeting so that the public can participate. But then, I put in a more pragmatic point of view here. What are the consequences? Well, if you open up your meeting, it may be inconvenient, okay? There might be some extra work that you have to do. You've got postings, you've got to find a room big enough, et cetera, et cetera. But if you don't open up your meeting, what could happen is someone could end up filing a complaint. And then you have to pass what I call the straight face test. And that could mean standing up in front of a judge and explaining to them why you didn't comply with the Sunshine Act, why you kept your meeting private and didn't allow the public to participate. And, there's a couple things to keep in mind here. If the judge disagrees, it is possible that they could levy sanctions against you and your organization. And that could be very painful. You don't want that to happen because not only is it painful on a personal level, but it sheds a bad light on your organization. So from a practical perspective, lean towards transparency. Open up your meetings to avoid bad things happening. Okay? Let's move on and let's answer the question, is it a meeting? Okay. The first thing, and here you can get a lot of guidance from the codes in Pennsylvania that govern certain class cities, townships, boroughs, and to a lesser degree, school districts, okay, providing guidance on just what is a meeting. And the first question we have to answer is there a quorum? Okay, and this differs from type of jurisdiction to type of jurisdiction. Okay, for instance, first-class townships and boroughs, in order to have a quorum present, they must be physically present at the meeting. Okay, everyone else, you can have a person phone in to meet the quorum. However, if they phone in, the conversation must be direct, meaning everyone must be able to hear the person phoning in, and the person phoning in must be able to hear everyone else. Essentially, you can't have someone sitting there with a phone up to their ear relaying information. Well, Fred votes this way, or Sally says, this as part of her, why she's voting this particular way. It has to be direct. Now, if you are part of a first-class township or a borough, if you have the quorum physically present, then anybody in addition to the quorum can then phone in. And the same standards apply where the conversation has to be direct. All right? Then we need to answer the question, is there deliberation? Okay, and remember, the definition of deliberation is any conversation that could result in a decision. And that word could is important there. It doesn't say will result in, but it says could result. So again, it gets very subjective. Thus, and this is a common question. We'll get a phone call, okay? Someone saw 3 of their township supervisors down at the restaurant the other morning having breakfast together. Isn't that illegal? Well, no, not necessarily. It could be that they're talking about the weather, that they're talking about their kids, how everybody's doing. You know, maybe they were friends before they got elected. Maybe they become friends since they were elected. But as long as they're not talking about township business, they're not deliberating. Okay, they're not talking about something that could lead to a decision. So it's completely legal for them to have breakfast together. Okay. Then we have to answer the question, is there decision making? Decision making typically is a vote, okay? But it could be just an informal polling of those elected officials present. You know, well, what do you think? What should we do? That is decision making. But and if that takes place outside of the public eye, then it's highly likely, highly possible that it would be a violation of the Sunshine Act. And, you know, I always hedge that because there's always exceptions and there are exceptions to the exceptions. But, you know, so I want to be careful. It's not always black and white, but you need to be, you know, if you are an elected official or a member of a committee, you need to be very careful about conversations that you have with other members of the elected board or your committee to ensure that you're not in violation of the Sunshine Act. And one of the things that I want to caution you about, this always happens when it comes up, it's usually at the beginning of the calendar year when a new board is seated. And it's beware of email meetings. Many times, you know, a new board will be seated with new members, and perhaps the person elected president is from a business background, and they're used to doing everything by email. Okay, we don't need a meeting. We can just have, you know, an email conversation here and get this thing settled. It's very efficient. Unfortunately, that doesn't work when you have the Sunshine Act to contend with. And if you think that, well, I'll just send emails out one by one and we can argue then that there wasn't a quorum. Well, that doesn't work, okay? Because essentially you are having the same conversation with different elected members just at different times, okay? And there already is some decisions that said this, you know, is inconsistent with the Sunshine Act, and you're going to have to stop doing it. So, you know, be very careful about how you use email for policy level decisions that your elected board or your committee may be wrestling with. And I emphasize policy because there is a difference, okay, between agency business and what's termed as administrative action. Now, if you're just having an email conversation to determine if you need to change the time of the meeting, let's say, because of some conflicts of some sort, you know, you could argue that that's administrative action. But let me give you a more concrete example. Let's say that at a prior public meeting, the elected board, all above board, all consistent with the Sunshine Act, voted to allocate $2 million for street paving for this calendar year. Now the decision needs to be made, what streets or what parts of streets are we going to pave? Okay. The policy level decision was made per the vote to allocate the $2 million. How we spend that $2 million on specific paving projects in the township, that is administrative inaction, okay? The big vote already took place, and it took place in the public eye. The administrative level decisions now, for instance, what sort of blacktop are we going to use? Where are we going to use it? What sort of resources do we need? Is it going to be, do we have the resources in-house with our public works crew, or do we have to contract this out? Those are all administrative decisions in nature, and something like that could occur outside of the public eye, whether it be email or gatherings to sort out these administrative decisions. Okay. Again, somewhat subjective. You want to be very careful about this, but I don't want you to come away from this thinking that whenever we meet, we have to have a sunshine notice and open it up to the public. That's not always the case. And here's a good example where you would not have to have a gathering subject to the Sunshine Act. Okay, and then you also have work sessions and conferences and retreats. Work sessions, especially with, for instance, school districts, it's a very specific type of gathering. School districts, they have their monthly business meetings open to the public. That's where they vote. That's where they deliberate. But many school districts also will have a monthly work session. Work sessions are primarily for the educational benefit of the board members, where members of the staff will, for instance, make presentations on projects that are occurring, matters of import, just things that the board members need to know in order to make educated decisions when it comes time to deliberate and to vote. Okay, so they can have these work sessions. Now, members of the board can ask questions of the person making the presentation, and then they can have that conversation back and forth. What they cannot do is discuss the merits of the presentation amongst themselves, okay, because that is deliberation, and you're not allowed to deliberate outside of the public eye. Okay, now, there's something that I want to talk about here that not everyone does this, but and not many do it actually, but we've seen a kind of a growing trend here, and it's where school districts in particular will have these gatherings that they call a committee of the whole, or they'll have what they call a work session, but they're in full compliance with the Sunshine Act. So sometimes they will actually take a vote during what is otherwise called a work session in name only. And I think they need to be very careful about that, because when you call it a work session, you're basically creating the impression that no business is going to transpire. And then if you sneak something through and have a vote on something of consequence, you could find yourself again facing that straight face test. And I know I wouldn't want to have to do that, especially, you never want to play fast and loose with the law, okay? Some people think that they're smart enough, they can outthink the law, but it always comes back to bite you. Just take my word for it. So you don't want to try and do that, okay? So at the work session or these conferences and retreats, number one, there's no deliberation. Number two, there's no decision-making. Communication is all one way. Okay, questions popped up here. Is there a difference between second-class townships and borough for any of these rules and deliberations? Not that I am aware of, Ryan, but I would suggest looking at the actual codes themselves. And you can find these codes online fairly easily. There are organizations that represent, for instance, second-class townships, PSATs, the Pennsylvania State Township, Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors. Yeah, there, I got it. Okay, you can find the second-class township code on their website. Same way with the Pennsylvania State Association of Boroughs, PSAB. They have the borough code on their website, and you can refer to them for specifics. But off the top of my head, I don't think the rules are necessarily any different when it comes to the definition of deliberations and so forth. I don't think they get into it. Okay, let's change the page and let me get a swig of coffee here quick. Okay, first leg of the stool, public notice. Fairly clear cut in the Sunshine Act. Again, looking at the codes, usually you have to have the first meeting of the new board, typically on the first Tuesday of the month in January. It's commonly referred to as the organizational meeting. Prior to these meetings, there needs to be public notice. It needs to be published at least 72 hours in advance. It needs to give where the meeting is occurring, the time, and so forth. And then it also needs to list the dates for the remaining meetings for the rest of the calendar year. It needs to be in the form of a legal notice in a paid newspaper of general circulation. Okay, newspaper articles are what are known as puff pieces. They don't count. Having it on your website, although that is a great practice and we encourage it to get the word out to the public as to when your meetings are and maybe the minutes for your meetings, the agendas, which we're going to talk about, and so forth. That's great. However, just having it on your website does not satisfy this provision of the Sunshine Act. And those sales circulars, those free circulars that fill up our mailboxes several times a week, they don't count either. Now, I recognize, as many others do, that there are significant structural changes taking place in the news media industry that's making this harder and harder to do. The city of Harrisburg, 20 years ago, there were at least 2 daily newspapers. Now, I think there's one, and it's published 3 days a week, okay? It's a lot more difficult to get your legal notices in a timely fashion, all right? But this is what the law says, and until the legislature changes this provision, this is what we have to adhere to. And then the notices also need to be posted at the meeting site, when your public meetings are occurring. Okay, more public notice. For regular meetings, it's 72 hours in advance. Then the Sunshine Law allows you to have special meetings. Okay, what's a special meeting? Well, let's say something has come up and we can't wait until next month, or maybe the next quarter, whenever the next regular scheduled meeting is. Okay, so we have to have a meeting sooner than that. So we're going to have a special meeting. Now, all other provisions of the Sunshine Act apply, except now it goes down from 72 hours to 24 hours advance notice. Okay, still needs to be published in a public newspaper of general circulation for this jurisdiction, but only 24 hours. Then you're allowed to have what are called emergency meetings, where there's no requirement for public notification, but it needs to be a bona fide emergency. Quick example here. We're a small borough. We have one snowplow, and it's an old girl, okay? This snowplow has seen its better days. We're having trouble getting parts for it. It's breaking down more frequently. As a matter of fact, it just broke down, and the local guys say they can't fix it. It's given up the ghost. And the forecast says that tomorrow night, there is a nor'easter coming through that's going to dump a couple feet of snow on the borough. We need to buy a snowplow, and we need to buy it now, okay? It's an emergency. And it so happens that down the road, there's one sitting on the lot. So we're going to have an emergency meeting. we're going to vote to buy a new snowplow because of the pending storm. Okay. Perfectly legitimate set of circumstances that would be consistent with this provision. Okay. But just be careful. Again, don't try to outthink the law. Don't think you can create a fake emergency to justify having an emergency meeting. Again, it'll come back to bite you. I can think of one school board meeting where someone happened to record this statement that no one thought, was being recorded, where the board chair said something to the effect, and we're doing this to get around the Sunshine Act. All right, well, that made it to the news media, that made it to the district attorney. Things did not go well for that board chair. All right, and then there's no notification requirement for cancellations, like if someone's sick and you can't get a quorum together. But here's another example where using your social media can really get you a lot of mileage. Put it on your website that we have to cancel tomorrow night's meeting, or put it on Facebook or whatever. Let the news media know, even though you're not required to do so, because nothing upsets people more than coming down to Borough Hall and all the lights are out, the door's locked, and the meeting had been canceled, but nobody said anything. Okay. So, please, it's just good public service to notify the public about any meeting cancellations. Are there parameters that define an emergency under the Sunshine Act? No, and there's no case law that I'm aware of. But I think it's one of those things that goes back to the United States Supreme Court when they were wrestling with pornography, and it's like, I know it when I see it sort of stuff, where, if it's truly an emergency, you can look at the circumstances and you have a pretty good idea what is and what isn't an emergency. But as far as the act itself and any case law, no, you're not going to find any language that would help you out there. Good question, though. Good question. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about agendas. The agenda provisions of the Sunshine Act was passed about 5 years ago. I think we're going on now. And it was done by the legislature in response to a lot of complaints about agencies that would schedule very important votes to take place at public meetings without any advance notice, and would completely catch the taxpayers by surprise. Okay, so in response to that, these provisions of the Sunshine Act were passed, and there has been some case law that helps us out with this, which I'll talk about too. But essentially, the agenda requirements in the Sunshine Act require that all agencies must post an agenda of issues to be deliberated on, meaning discussed, or planned official action, meaning a vote, at least 24 hours prior to the public meeting. Okay. So 24 hours before your meeting is called to order, you have to have an agenda, and it has to be posted. And this includes regular and special meetings, okay? Obviously, it wouldn't be required for emergency meetings because they're not typically open to the public because you don't have time, okay? And it wouldn't include work sessions, conferences, and executive sessions because no official action can take place at work sessions, conferences, or executive sessions. And I will be talking about executive sessions here in a moment. Okay, now, if the agency has a website, the agenda must be posted on the website. And I have an asterisk there because there are many agencies that while they may not have a website, they do post on social media, such as like Facebook. They'll have a Facebook page. If that's the case, you put the agenda on your Facebook page, all right? You're not required to have a website. You're not required to have a Facebook page, but if you do, your agenda should be there at least 24 hours in advance prior to the public meeting. It needs to be available, actually needs to be posted at your agency offices, and it needs to be posted at the meeting site. And then finally, you need to have copies of the agenda available for the public at the meeting itself, so that when they come in, if they ask for a copy of the agenda, you have some copies there that you can hand out to them. Now, what about changing the agenda? Well, prior to the 24-hour threshold, you can change the agenda any way you see fit, okay? As long as once that 24-hour threshold has been met, that agenda is pretty much written in stone, okay? You cannot change it. Now, originally, given language during the dance of legislation here, some of you may be old enough to remember that book, but during the dance of legislation, we used to advise that you could change the agenda during the meeting by vote. Okay, but there has been a court case, and it's Coleman versus Parkland School District, where the Commonwealth Court weighed in and said, no, you cannot change the agenda given our reading of the Sunshine Act and the agenda provisions. So what can you do? All right, well, you can only change the agenda during the 24-hour threshold leading up to the meeting or during the meeting itself if the change represents a de minimis change where there is no expenditure of money as a result of whatever you're voting on, and you're not entering into any sort of contract as a result of what you're voting on. Okay, so basically, like if you're passing some sort of resolution, okay, you could conceivably amend the agenda to discuss the merits of the resolution. And in order for that to happen, okay, there has to first be, this is during the meeting, there has to first be a vote to amend the agenda, right? And why do you do that? Well, because the vote represents official action, which gets recorded in the minutes of the meeting, okay? It becomes a matter of record. Okay, so we're going to have a vote to change the agenda. The chairperson must announce and give the reason why we're changing the agenda. Well, it's so that we can discuss and potentially pass a resolution. All right. And then you have the discussion. Okay, we assume that it passes. And then we have the discussion on the resolution. And remember, deliberation is any discussion that could result in a decision. So maybe you have the discussion and there's no vote. You decide, no, we're not going to vote on it. Okay, it just isn't worth it. So we're not going to do it. But nevertheless, you had to change the agenda just to deliberate. So that's how that would work. Okay, and what happened with Parkland is that the school district, they had entered into negotiations with the teachers union, and that morning the union ratified the new contract. So the school board, even though it wasn't on the agenda, they said, hey, since the Teachers Association has approved the contract, why don't we go ahead and vote to ratify the contract so it becomes official? And why don't we do it tonight? And they went through that exercise of opening the agenda, amending the agenda, and then having discussion and vote. But because it was not de minimis, because it involved entering into a contract, the court said, no, you cannot do that. And they basically voided the vote. And they told the school district they needed to go back and do a do-over and make sure it was included on the agenda. Okay, now I'll get to the question in a moment. If by chance the agenda is amended, the amended agenda needs to be posted within 24 hours. Now, the Sunshine Act is not specific on where it's posted, but it would make sense that you would follow the same criteria that they use for posting the original agenda. Websites, social media, at the offices, and at the meeting site, you would post the agenda. Then the question comes up, well, how long do we need to post the amended agenda? Again, Sunshine Act doesn't say, but this is Georgia's logic, and that carries absolutely no weight in a court of law. But since the threshold for posting the agenda prior to the meeting is 24 hours, it would make sense to me that you could post the agenda for 24 hours within the 24-hour threshold after the meeting. But again, a judge may disagree if you stand there and say, well, this is what George says. The first thing they're going to ask is, who's George? And George is nobody as far as the judge is concerned. But that's what I would do. Okay. And then the minutes, the official record of the meeting must reflect the changes to the agenda, because the agenda is also like an official record, or part of the official record. Okay, Katie, can the agenda be posted on a bulletin board in the township building? Well, yeah, that would be your public office 24 hours prior to the meeting, or must it be posted in a place viewable outside of the public? No, I think the bulletin board would be acceptable. Okay, if there's like a normal place where you post stuff like that. Okay, school board. If a candidate accepts employment on the day of the board meeting, can the employment be added to the agenda by amending the agenda, or would that be considered an expenditure and not acceptable? Okay, I'm assuming the candidate is accepting employment. Okay, a candidate would not be a member of the board. Okay, that's just somebody different. Can the candidate accept employment on the day of the board meeting? Can the employment be added to the agenda by amending the agenda? Okay, it's going to depend on whether that candidate has a separate contract. For instance, I would venture, and I'm not an expert on school boards and how they operate, but a superintendent or an assistant superintendent may have an individual employment contract. Okay, and if that's the case, I would say you would have a problem if you tried to approve that contract that day, okay, because you're entering into a contract within the 24-hour window. If, however, the candidate is entering into a position where there may not be a contract, or if the contract is already in place, like for instance, let's say our principals are a separate bargaining unit, and I'm really stretching here. I don't know if that's an accepted practice or not, but let's say we have a contract for teachers, and then let's say we have a separate contract for principals. They're part of their own bargaining unit. They're not considered management. And that contract has already been negotiated and ratified, and we have someone coming in as a new principal. So the contract itself doesn't change. Possibly, given that set of circumstances, you could vote to employ that person. But boy, I'd be really careful about that. If that's something that normally would be included on an agenda, and you would normally vote on something like that with at least 24 hours advance notice, I would lean towards playing it safe and either waiting until the next board meeting or having a special meeting of some sort. I just don't know enough about how school boards operate, Danielle, to give you a black and white answer there. The answer is it depends, but be careful with that one, because depending on the circumstances, you could find yourselves getting into trouble there. I understand, it's a good question, but I just wish I could give you a better answer. Okay. Good questions. Let's move on. Another sip of coffee. Let's talk about public comment. Okay. Now, first off, Ann, this is one of those interesting areas where you go by what the law doesn't say as opposed to what the law does say. And when you look at the public comment provisions, there's no mention of state government, meaning that public comment does not apply to state government agencies, only local government agencies. Commenters can be limited to residents and taxpayers of the jurisdiction that the elected board represents. Okay, if someone comes in from out of town, signs up for public comment, you can tell them, no, we're not going to allow you to comment. You can allow them, but you also have the right not to allow them. You have the right to comment on any issues that are or may be before the board prior to any vote taking place. That word may is somewhat problematic because it opens the door to comment on anything I darn well feel commenting about, including the potholes on my street, even though we're not talking about the potholes on my street. But there are ways that you can deal with that through the board establishing reasonable rules for public comment. Typically, we think about time limits. However, one of the things I want to talk about, this is not in the act, but it's what we consider to be a best practice. And there are many agencies now doing this. They actually have multiple public comment periods during a meeting. You have the specific public comment where we're going to allow you to comment, but please, just about what we're getting to vote about. And then we have a general public comment at the end of the meeting where you can talk about your potholes and whatever, okay, and refer to that. It's not in the law, okay, but it's a trend we've noticed that's been brought to our attention that everyone's saying it really works out well for us. You might want to take a look at it if this is a problem for you. But be very careful about shutting someone down during public comment, okay? Because again, there is precedent with the courts. One that comes to mind, I think it was the Pennsbury School District a couple years ago, where the solicitor or assistant solicitor, someone like that, was shutting people down during heated public comment and said, your comments aren't relevant, you're done, okay? And that was the term used. And it ended up, the members of the public, a group of them, filed a federal court suit saying that they abridged my right to free speech, and the courts agreed with them, and it ended up, I'm told, it ended up being a settlement. So be very careful about how you deal with public comment and people's right to free speech, okay? Another thing you can do is, let's say you have an important vote coming up, a lot of public interest, some people come in, they're all wearing the same t-shirts, and they all sign up for public comment, okay? You're gonna be there all night, you're thinking. So there's nothing wrong with the chair approaching that group and saying, look, how about if you appoint a spokesperson and we will give you 10 minutes public comment rather than the typical 3. If they agree to that, problem solved, okay? It is a reasonable rule that you could establish to get yourselves through the meeting. And you would still be in compliance with the Sunshine Act. Okay, some questions have popped up here. If a resident is split between 2 different townships, taxes are only paid to one. Are they still allowed to attend both? Megan, I don't know. The law says resident or taxpayer. So I would say yes. I mean, if part of I'm not aware of any case law that deals with that, but just a reading of the law, I would lean towards yes, but I would suggest talking to your solicitor. Okay, let them sort it out. That's what they get paid to do. But yeah, I've never encountered that. And that's interesting because I live in a school district that is in 2 counties. Okay, there seems to be a fine line between discussion and deliberation. Where does the proof lie? Well, deliberation would be about the jurisdiction's business, okay? And it's kind of like the right to know law, where a transaction or activity related to government operations, meaning the jurisdiction that you're responsible for, It's very similar. You know, are we talking about the business of the borough? Are we talking about the business of the township? Or is it just general discussion about life in general? Okay, the line, as soon as you start talking about township business, that's deliberation. Okay, and if you're doing that outside of the public eye, I would say you're playing with fire. You open yourselves up to being called before a judge. Okay, can public comment rules include submission of a hard copy of the comments? I think it can be an option at the commenter's discretion. But what we get into, okay, there were some practices developed during COVID where written public comment was acceptable. I think now that the COVID emergency is long behind us, public comment, if someone wants to stand up in front of their public officials and speak, they have a right to do that. Okay? And the jurisdiction cannot say, no, give us your comments in writing instead. I base that not on any legal decision, but several years ago, the executive director for the Office of Open Records and myself testified before a committee of the legislature, and they made it quite clear that public comment involves physical interaction, meaning the public has a right to stand up, face the public official, one-on-one, not online, but in a physical setting, and tell them what they think, okay? The legislators made that very clear. So, I think that's the context of your question, and that's, the basis for my answer there. There is another thing that comes to mind, and I realize we're running over an hour, but that's okay. I'm here all afternoon if we need be, or morning, where someone will submit written comments and say, and I want these made part of the public record, okay? That's at the discretion of the public officials, okay? No member of the public has a right to say, my written comments need to be part of the minutes, okay? But to answer your question, yeah. Okay, and I see you put a thank you there, so I think I've answered it. Do public comment rules need to be established in a policy? Charmaine, usually they do, okay? It's one of those where it depends, but typically, if it's going to be a policy on how the agency administers their public meetings, it's usually approved in advance. And that saves any sort of arbitrary and capricious by saying, well, the policy applies to you, but not to someone else, or we're gonna do this right here and now. This is our policy, okay? Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I think it's best practice to think about what sort of situations we may encounter during a public meeting, or what experience do we have, and saying, okay, in order to address this, to ensure that our meetings run as smoothly as possible, we're going to establish these policies, and you would vote them into practice. That way, if it does end up in court, you can say, our policy was well established and it was published per our meeting records, and it wasn't any secret, it wasn't any surprise to anybody. I think that would save you a lot of trouble in the long run. Charmaine, good question. I know it comes up a lot. And I think that's probably the best approach. All right, moving on, let's talk about executive sessions. Executive sessions are gathering of the public officials or the committee Oh, and you know what? I want to go back and talk about committees and public officials. You can have a committee that is subject to the Sunshine Act. Okay, it met all of those criteria that we talked about, and there's not a single elected official on that committee. There's a mistaken perception by many that you must have a quorum of public officials on a committee in order to be subject to the Sunshine Act. That's not accurate. Like I said, you can have a committee without a single public official, and you're still subject to the Sunshine Act based on the criteria that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. Sorry, I forgot about that. Okay, so executive sessions are gatherings of these groups where you can talk about matters of highly sensitive nature. And we'll get into the definitions of that. The executive sessions can be held before, during, or after an open meeting, or they can be announced that we're going to have an executive session at a future date and time. However, you must give the complete reason for why you're going into executive session. And there's case law that supports this. It's City of Reading versus the Reading Eagle, where it was the practice of the chair to stand up and say, we're going into executive session to discuss personnel reasons. Okay, the Reading Eagle, which is the local newspaper in Berks County, said that's not enough. Okay, you need to tell us more of a reason as to why you're going into executive session. And this case, it makes interesting reading, but basically it said that, look, you know, this is democracy. You're supposed to have all decision-making occur in the public eye. But now you're saying that you've got something that you need to discuss in private. In order to do that, in order to maintain the public's trust, you've got to give sufficient explanation, sufficient reasoning to continue that trust. Okay, so simply saying for personnel reasons or for legal reasons is not enough. I saw one just recently. I really think, can tell I'm getting ready to say something important, that agencies are getting better at this because I've noticed agendas and I've noticed meeting records where they're saying we went into executive session to discuss the possible suspension of one of our employees due to a disciplinary issue. Okay, that tells me as a taxpayer that yes, going into executive session is justified. Or we're going into executive session to discuss litigation where a company is suing the borough. It's been filed in common pleas court. Here's the docket number. All right. That's enough for me to let me know that, yeah, it's legitimate as to why you're going into executive session. Okay. And that's pretty much what this Reading versus Reading Eagle court case concludes. Okay. Now, during executive session, there's no requirement to keep minutes, but if you do, there's a provision within the right to know law that says those minutes are not a public record, so they can be held private. No official action can be taken during executive session. No votes. Okay, all votes must occur in the public session. So let's say you're meeting for a disciplinary issue. You can poll the members and say, okay, what do you think? How are you going to vote? And discuss it, but you would conclude the executive session, reconvene in public session, and then take a vote. Okay, all in favor of suspending XYZ employee for 3 business days due to this disciplinary infraction, signify by saying aye. Okay, and that makes it official then. It becomes a matter of public record, meaning it's memorialized in the minutes of the public meeting. That's how that all works. If you fail to take the vote in a public session, and then, well, number one, you never took official action. So the action itself doesn't carry any weight. And if you think that the action took place, because you voted in executive session, well, that would be a violation of the act. All right. Okay. Questions popped up. Can the municipal officials just state the purpose is for person? Well, no. Okay, I covered that, Judith. So I think I already answered your question. And it's pretty clear that you can't do that. Okay. The reasons for executive session. What can you meet out of the public eye for? Well, personnel matters, hiring, firing, discipline. Now, it only involves a specific individual or a specific position. It does not apply to personnel policy in general. Like if you want to discuss leave policy for all employees in the city, you have to do that in public. But if you are discussing potential leave abuse by a specific employee, then that you could meet in executive session for. Discussing labor negotiations, well, yeah, you wouldn't want to divulge your negotiating strategy in a public meeting. Considering purchasing, leasing, or selling a property, because of valuations and so forth, you can discuss that in private. Consulting with counsel about litigation, yeah, legal strategy. Avoiding violating privilege or confidentiality, okay? Again, discussions between your solicitor and the elected officials can occur, actually should occur outside of the public eye due to attorney-client privilege. Discussing university admission standards, I don't know, I wasn't around in 1950 when that was written into the law. Or discussing emergency preparedness. Why can't I think of the phrase? Homeland security, that kind of stuff. Evacuation plans. Okay, oh my gosh, look at this one. Executive session specific to personnel matters. Are there any restrictions related to naming persons? Oh, okay. Yeah, it depends, John. For instance, I am aware of contracts that have non-embarrassment clauses, meaning that management is not allowed to do anything that would create undue embarrassment to an employee. So when you're announcing, it becomes a balancing act. When you're announcing to the public that you're going into executive session to discuss potential disciplinary matter, you would say something to the effect, one of our employees, okay? However, what if you're a small borough and you only have one employee? Well, everyone's kind of looking, we know who you're talking about. But, for purposes of the contract, you're not publicly embarrassing that employee by naming them in public. Now, if it becomes a legal matter, let's say the employee turns around and files like a wrongful termination suit or whatever, well, that's on them. Okay, but you need to balance discretion versus the public's right to know why you're going into executive session. It's not always easy, but usually you can figure it out. I mean, you're smart people, okay? So, you're not here because let's just leave it at that. Or I'm going to say something embarrassing. It's usually the situation is black and white enough that you can figure out the appropriate thing to say to let the public know it's legit versus potentially embarrassing an employee or a person that you're meeting to talk about. Okay. Good question, though, and yeah, that comes up frequently. Okay, now let's talk about violations because I kind of hinted at this earlier about the straight face test. If, first offhand, I'm going to get another sip of coffee because my throat is really dry. Okay, during a public meeting, at any time during a public meeting, this is what the law says. A person can stand up and say, I believe you're violating the Sunshine Act. And as long as they do it respectfully, they are not out of order, they are not in violation of the act itself, law is pretty clear cut, saying they can do that. Now, what if they do that and the board realizes, you know what, I think you're right. We forgot to vote on this issue, or we forgot to allow comment. So we're going to do that now, okay? An agency can cure a perceived violation before a complaint is filed. Okay, and standing up and saying, I believe you violated the act is not a complaint. That's simply you're putting them on notice. So the agency can cure that perceived violation, no harm, no foul. What if the agency says, no, you're wrong, but thanks for letting us know, sit down now, we're going to continue with the meeting. Well, the public has 30 days where they can go to court, and for a state agency, it would be the Pennsylvania Commonwealth Court. For a local agency, it would be their county court of common pleas, where they can go to court and seek legal relief, okay? And that's going to depend on what is it you want, all right? And you could seek declaratory relief, where the court says, yeah, they did wrong. You could, it just depends on the court. And I got to warn you, every county can be a little bit different in how they handle this. And there are some counties where they just don't have a lot of activity when it comes to the Sunshine Act. So they're not always familiar with, how to process your complaint. But, if you keep pressing, and ultimately they figure it out. If you think that there is some sort of criminal intent in what the board did related to its violation, you could also go to the district attorney. But the district attorney can only rule on the criminal aspect. The judge would rule on the civil aspect of the perceived violation. And depending on how the court operates, typically the judge would call a hearing and both sides would testify. And this is where that straight face test comes. If the judge should agree with the complaint and say, yes, a violation occurred, they have a great degree of discretion in the sanctions that they can levy. It could be something as simple as a slap on the wrist saying, don't do it again. Or they could void the vote. Or they could potentially void the meeting. And I've seen that done recently. And if it's particularly egregious, they could levy fines against the public officials. The public officials pay the fines out of their own pocket. The agency is not allowed to cover the fines for them. So this is where it gets painful. It's up to $1,000 for the first violation, up to $2,000 for the second violation. In recent years, I've also seen judges get creative where they required training for the public officials. And they've sent them to us here at the Office of Open Records, and we've conducted trainings based on a judge's order. And then we write a letter to the judge saying, XYZ council person and the mayor participated in training, provided by our agency. Okay, going back to public comments, did you say there's no requirement in the Sunshine Act to include public comments in the meeting minutes? Yes, I did say that. However, Tessa, I would suggest talking to your solicitor about this, because I am a very small minority that is of this opinion. And I have to go back and read the act itself. But there is, okay, it comes down to words. The term comment is used throughout the Sunshine Act related to a member of the public standing up and making comment. When it comes to including a person speaking during and it being referenced in the minutes, the term used is testify, not comment. I am of the opinion, and understand, I'm not an attorney and I'm not providing a legal opinion here. I'm just a guy who, for the last 12 years, has worked with the Sunshine Act. I believe there is a difference between testimony, or testifying, and commenting. Not everyone agrees with me. Okay, so that's why I said what I did. I would rely on the expertise of your solicitor. Okay. Yeah, I haven't had to say that one. I haven't had to discuss that one in a couple of years, but that's just George. And like I said, if you mention George in front of the judge, he's going to say, who? Okay, Judith, I had a customer and this part about meetings can be voided. Yeah, that's just, depending on the judge and their perception as to what is the best solution to deal with a perceived violation of the Sunshine Act, they can void a meeting. And we saw this happen a couple of years back with, I think it was the Scranton School District, where because of some technical issues with how the meeting was being streamed and the fact that members of the public could not observe the meeting anymore, the judge went and voided the entire meeting. He said, you guys got to do it over. So they can do it. They can do it, and they have done it. Okay. We're close to the end of the presentation here. Let's see what we got. Yeah, miscellaneous stuff, just to keep in mind. An agency must produce meeting minutes recording board attendance and who voted for and against. Okay. Meeting minutes represent an official memorialization as to what took place. There is more information on meeting minutes depending on the code of your, where you live in the jurisdiction. They oftentimes get into minutes as well. If a roll call vote is taken, the minutes must reflect how then each member voted, yea or nay. Now the public, when we get into recording meetings, the public can record meetings unannounced without letting anyone know. It's not a violation of the Sunshine Act, and it's not a violation of Pennsylvania wiretap law. Okay, I can take my phone, set it on a record, put it in my pocket. I don't have to tell anybody, and it's completely legal for me to do that during a public meeting. There is no expectation of privacy. And what I recommend is that at the beginning of the meeting, when the chair is making introductions and announcements and so forth, they would include a statement to the effect that this is a public meeting, there's no expectation of privacy, it can be recorded. And if by chance the agency is recording the meeting, that recording is considered a public record, discoverable through the right to know law until that recording is no longer available. Okay. Moving on. Yes, okay, we are at the end of the presentation. If you have any more questions, please feel, now's the time to get them in. If we end the presentation and then suddenly, a dozen questions pop into your head, contact the office, okay? They will, okay, how long of record retention for the recorded meeting? Okay, John, there's nothing in the Sunshine Act that covers that. There is, however, the Pennsylvania Municipal Records Act that applies to certain municipalities. It doesn't apply to others. You want to take a look at that. It's online. The Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission oversees that act. Bureau of Archives, State Record Center. It's online, and it's an excellent resource, not just for recordings, but anything that you may, any records that you may have in your possession. It kind of tells you how long you hold on to those records before you throw them out. And it's wonderful to throw things out. Okay? Okay, thank you for your comments. Thank you for your kind comments. Final word here. Take a look at the resources that are available. I'll say it right now. Our website is the best government website you'll ever encounter. It's updated 6 days a week with new information decisions by our office, decisions by courts, anything about transparency and government. You can subscribe to our X feed every morning at 7 a.m. We will wake you up with the news of the day on government transparency. Take a look at that. But like I said earlier, if you want to contact our office with any questions, any issues that you're having, the phones are open now, folks. Dial in and talk to one of our administrative staff who are just waiting to hear about your issue. Okay. Hey, have a good rest of the day. I hear the rain is finally going to stop, but fingers crossed there. And we'll be back in 2 weeks with our next webinar. Take care, folks, and see you on the flip side.